I worked for 50 Cent when Diddy came up, and what he told me still haunts me. I'm breaking my silence now because the weight of carrying this alone has become unbearable. And before you think this is another industry gossip story, it's not. This isn't about money, fame, or who betrayed who for a record deal. This is about what happens when someone you trust more than anyone in the world looks you in the eye and reveals a truth so dark, so devastating, that it fundamentally rewires who you are as a person. By the time I understood what 50 was really telling me, it was already too late. The damage was done. And the worst part? His confession was an act of mercy disguised as betrayal. In the next few minutes, I'm going to tell you exactly what he said, why it matters, and why I've carried this burden in silence for so long. But I need you to understand something first. This story doesn't have a happy ending. It has a true ending, and the truth is far more haunting than any lie could ever be. When I first met 50 Cent, I was nothing. And I mean nothing. I was hungry in a way that only someone with absolutely nothing to lose can be hungry. I had dreams of being part of something bigger than myself. But dreams don't pay rent. They don't feed you. They don't give you purpose. I was working dead-end jobs, going nowhere fast, watching the world move without me. Then one night, everything changed. I was at an event, nothing fancy, just industry people mixing, networking, pretending they were all destined for greatness. 50 was there, not as some untouchable figure at that point, just a guy with presence, raw presence, the kind that makes you stop mid-conversation and pay attention. He noticed me. I don't know why. Maybe it was because I wasn't trying to impress him. Maybe it was because I was actually listening instead of scheming. But he pulled me aside, and in that moment, he saw something in me that I hadn't even seen in myself yet. "You got potential," he said. Simple, direct. But the way he said it, like he knew, changed my entire life trajectory. Within weeks, I was working for him, not in some glamorous capacity at first. I was handling logistics, managing details, making sure things ran smoothly behind the scenes. But 50 didn't treat me like a low-level assistant. He treated me like someone he was building. He'd pull me into meetings. He'd ask my opinion. He'd correct me when I was wrong, but he'd do it in a way that felt like mentorship, not humiliation. This was the early 2000s. The energy was different back then. Dangerous. Electric. You could feel something massive shifting in hip-hop. 50 was at the center of it, and somehow, I got to be in the room where it happened. What struck me most wasn't his success, though that was undeniable. It was his mind. 50 didn't just move in the industry. He thought about the industry in ways that were 3 steps ahead of everyone else. He'd talk about moves that wouldn't materialize for years, and then when they did, you'd realize he'd seen them coming all along. And he trusted me with his thoughts. Late nights in studios, in offices, in cars driving through the city, he talked to me about his vision. About where hip-hop was going. About who was real and who was fake. About the people you could trust and the ones who'd sell you out the second it benefited them. I felt chosen. And looking back now, I understand that feeling was intentional. 50 was building something specific in me. He was grooming me, but not in a predatory way. Or at least, that's what I believed then. He was preparing me for knowledge, for responsibility, for secrets. There were moments that should have alarmed me. Little things. The way his paranoia ran deep. The way he'd suddenly dismiss people from rooms without explanation. The way he'd ask me to do things. Small things, nothing illegal, but things that required absolute discretion. Things that required me to not ask questions. I never asked questions. One time, early on, I made a mistake. Nothing catastrophic. I'd mentioned something 50 said to someone outside the circle. Something harmless, or so I thought. When 50 found out, the look in his eyes, I'd never seen anything like it. Not anger, something colder. Something that made me understand, in that moment, that loyalty wasn't just preferred, it was required. It was survival. You understand me? He asked. And I did. Completely. After that, my loyalty calcified. It became absolute. I would have done anything for him. And I think he knew that. I think that's exactly what he wanted. There were moments of genuine brotherhood, though. Moments that felt real and unguarded. Times when he'd let the walls down and just be a person. Not a mogul, not a strategist, just someone navigating a world that was trying to consume him. I remember one night we were in a studio session that went until sunrise. The music was incredible. We were all riding that natural high that comes from creating something beautiful. And 50 turned to me and said something I'll never forget. This industry is going to try to make you into something you're not, he said. It's going to whisper in your ear that you need to do things you know are wrong. And the crazy part? It's going to make sense. It's going to feel justified, like everyone does it. Like it's just the cost of doing business. I remember asking him, then why do you stay in it? He looked at me for a long moment, and instead of answering directly, he said, because sometimes the only way to survive a machine is to understand how it works. And the only way to protect the people you care about is to know exactly where the danger is. I didn't understand what he meant then. I thought it was just 50 being cryptic, which he often was. But now I realize he was telling me something fundamental. He was warning me. He was showing me his hand and hoping I'd be smart enough to read it. But I wasn't. I was too busy being grateful. Too busy feeling like I'd finally found where I belonged. The work expanded. My role grew. I was handling more sensitive tasks, managing relationships with artists, producers, executives. I was becoming indispensable. And the deeper I got into the circle, the more I noticed the patterns. There was a tier system, though nobody ever said it explicitly. There were people on the inside, the real inner circle, and everyone else. And the people on the inside, they had access to things. Knowledge, power. But they also carried something heavy. A weight. You could see it in their eyes sometimes, in the way they'd go quiet during certain conversations. I started noticing that 50 would interact with certain people differently. His public rivals got his attention in a specific way, calculated, strategic. But there was one person he watched differently. One person whose name would make something shift in his entire demeanor. Diddy. At first, I thought it was just competitive rivalry. Diddy was the king. Bad Boy Records was the empire. Of course, 50 would be watching him. Of course, there would be tension there. That's how the industry worked. Egos competing, artists jockeying for position. But it was more than that. Whenever Diddy's name came up, something in 50's energy would change. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was something more complex. Something that felt like fear mixed with respect, mixed with something darker that I couldn't quite name. And I started to notice him watching me during these moments, studying my reaction, seeing if I was picking up on what he was putting down. One night, after a long day, 50 asked me a question that seemed random at the time. We were sitting in his office, the city lights spread out below us. He asked if you knew something true about someone, something really dark, but you also knew that telling anyone would destroy them. Would you still tell? I remember pausing. The question felt weighted with more than just curiosity. I don't know, I said honestly. I guess it depends on what the truth was. He nodded slowly. And then he said something that should have been my first real warning. The thing about truth is, once you know it, you can't unknow it. And sometimes, knowing the truth is more dangerous than living in the lie. We didn't talk about it further. He changed the subject, but that conversation sat with me. It burrowed into my brain and stayed there, growing roots. Looking back now, I can see what was happening. 50 was testing me, watching to see if I was ready, if I could handle what was coming. Because he'd already decided, I think, that he was going to tell me. He'd already decided that I was the person he needed to trust with this burden. But I didn't know any of that yet. I just knew that I was part of something important. I was on the inside. I was trusted. I was seen. And I would have done anything to keep it that way. But I didn't know then that 50 was watching me the same way he watched Diddy, searching for a weakness, a breaking point, a place where he could plant the seed of something that would change me forever. By 2003, 50 Cent wasn't just rising, he was ascending. And I was there to witness every single moment of it. Get Rich or Die Tryin' had already dropped and changed the entire landscape. But what came next was something else entirely. It wasn't just success, it was dominance. I watched him record Indie Club. I remember being in that studio when he first laid down those vocals. The energy in the room was electric in a way I'd never experienced before. Everyone could feel it. This wasn't just another song. This was a moment. This was something that would define a generation. When that track hit, the world shifted. Suddenly, 50 Cent wasn't just another rapper trying to make it. He was the rapper, the one everyone was talking about, the one everyone wanted to be around, the one everyone feared. My role expanded exponentially. I was managing his schedule, sitting in on meetings with executives, helping coordinate tours and appearances. I was traveling with him constantly, living in a world of private jets, exclusive clubs, endless opportunities. Everything I'd dreamed about when I was broke and hungry was suddenly real. But with that rise came something else, a change in 50's energy that I couldn't quite articulate at first. He became more isolated. Not physically, he was surrounded by people constantly. But psychologically, emotionally, he retreated. He trusted fewer people. He questioned more. He watched everyone with an intensity that was almost unsettling. And his obsession with Diddy grew. It wasn't something he talked about directly. It was more subtle than that. It was the way he'd pause when Diddy's name came up in conversation. The way his eyes would track mentions of Bad Boy Records. The way he'd ask seemingly casual questions about who was working with Diddy, what deals were being made, what parties Diddy was throwing. At first, I thought it was just competitive fire. That's what you'd expect from two titans in the same space. But this felt different. This felt personal in a way that went beyond rivalry. I started paying attention. Started noticing the patterns. 50 would get intelligence, and I mean real intelligence, about what Diddy was doing. Not through gossip or industry chatter, through actual sources, people who were close to him. And 50 would process this information with an intensity that was almost obsessive. He'd sit alone in his office for hours, just thinking. I'd bring him coffee or handle business, and he'd barely register my presence. His mind was somewhere else, somewhere darker. One time I asked him directly, "What's going on with you and Diddy? Is there something specific?" He looked at me like I'd asked him to reveal state secrets. And then he said, "Nothing's going on." That's the problem. I didn't understand what he meant. But I learned not to push it. The paranoia intensified around this time. Security tightened. Fewer people were allowed into certain spaces. 50 started being more selective about who he'd speak freely around. And I noticed that I was being kept in those inner circles. Deliberately. He'd dismiss other people and keep me there. During conversations that seemed sensitive. During meetings where deals were being discussed. During moments where vulnerability was showing. I felt honored. I felt trusted. I didn't realize I was being positioned. There were other signs too. 50 started looking different. The stress was visible. He'd lost weight. His eyes had a hollowness to them sometimes, like he wasn't sleeping properly. Like something was eating at him from the inside. I'd ask if he was okay and he'd dismiss it. "I'm good, just focused." But he wasn't just focused. He was haunted. And his comments about the industry started getting darker, more specific, more knowing. He'd say things like, "This game isn't about talent, it's about leverage. And the people at the top, they know where all the bodies are buried." Or, "Success in this industry comes with a price, and not everyone's willing to pay it. But everyone who makes it to the top, they all paid something." These comments would come out of nowhere. We'd be in a car, driving through the city, and he'd just start talking. And I'd listen. Always listening. He started asking me questions too. Specific questions about my ambitions. What I wanted out of life, whether I could handle the pressure of staying close to him, whether I had any weaknesses, any vices, any dependencies, any vulnerabilities. At the time, I thought he was just being a mentor, trying to build me up. But I understand now that he was assessing me, measuring me, determining whether I was strong enough for what was coming. One night, we were at his place, a massive mansion that felt more like a fortress than a home. Security everywhere, cameras, the kind of infrastructure that screams I'm protecting myself from something. We were alone, which was rare. 50 poured us both drinks and sat down with a heaviness that was palpable. "You ever wonder," he said, "about the people who don't make it? The ones who have all the talent in the world but never break through?" "Sometimes," I said. "It's not always because they're not good enough," he continued. "Sometimes it's because they know things. Or they refused to know things. Or they wanted to know things but couldn't handle what they found out." He took a sip of his drink and looked at me with an intensity that made my stomach tighten. "This industry," he said slowly, "it tests you in ways you can't imagine. And the people who rise to the top, they're not necessarily the most talented. They're the ones who can look at darkness and not blink." I remember asking him, "Are you saying you've looked at darkness?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, "I'm saying that the higher you climb, the more you have to see. And once you see certain things, you become responsible for them." That conversation stuck with me for weeks. Around this time, I started noticing things about Diddy through 50's eyes. The way people talked about him. The reverence. The fear. There was something about his power that went beyond just being successful. It was almost intimidating. Not in a competitive way. In a dangerous way. I'd see Diddy at industry events, always surrounded by people, always commanding the room. And I'd notice 50 watching him, not with envy or anger, with something that looked almost like recognition, like he was seeing something in Diddy that he understood on a level that was difficult to articulate. People started changing around 52. His inner circle became tighter. People who'd been loyal for years started disappearing. And when I'd ask what happened to them, 50 would just say they weren't reliable or couldn't be trusted. But I noticed a pattern. The people who left were the ones who asked too many questions, the ones who seemed like they might not follow orders without hesitation, the ones who had their own moral compasses. 50 was purifying his circle, removing anyone who might resist, anyone who might question. And I, for some reason, was staying. I was being kept close. One of the people who left was someone I'd become friends with, a guy named Marcus, who'd worked with 50 for years. One day he was there, the next day he was gone. I asked 50 what happened. Marcus was getting too comfortable, 50 said coldly. Comfort breeds complacency, and complacency is a liability. That was it. No further explanation. Marcus was erased from the circle as if he'd never existed. I never heard from Marcus again. But the thing that really shifted my understanding was a moment that happened late one night. 50 had been drinking more than usual. Not drunk, but loosened up in a way that was rare. We were in his studio, just the two of us, and a song came on. I can't even remember which one now, but it was a Diddy track. 50 listened to it in complete silence, and when it ended, he turned to me with an expression that I'd never seen before. It was a mix of respect, fear, and something that looked almost like pity. "That's a brilliant mind," he said quietly, referring to Diddy. "Brilliant, and completely corrupted." "Corrupted how?" I asked. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, "That's the question, isn't it? That's the thing that keeps me up at night." And then he changed the subject, like he'd said too much. But he hadn't said too much. He'd said exactly enough to plant the seed, enough to make me understand that something deeper was going on, something that went beyond competition or rivalry. Something personal. The gap between 50 and Diddy grew wider as time went on. Publicly, they barely acknowledged each other. But privately, 50's obsession with understanding Diddy, with knowing what he was doing, with staying one step ahead, it consumed him. I watched his paranoia deepen, his isolation increase, his questions become more specific, more urgent, and I watched him begin the process of preparing me. Testing my loyalty, determining whether I could handle secrets, whether I could be trusted with knowledge that could destroy empires. He was grooming me for a confession. I just didn't know it yet, but I had no idea that the obsession I was watching 50 develop wasn't about competition or rivalry. It was about protection. He was trying to understand Diddy because he knew something about him, something dark, something that was going to require him to make an impossible choice. And he was preparing me to be on the receiving end of that choice, whether I was ready or not. It happened on a Tuesday night in late 2005. Nothing seemed different that day, but sometimes the most significant moments arrive without warning. Your entire life becomes divided into before and after. 50 called me into his office late that evening. There was something heavier in his tone than usual. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And once I do, everything changes. You won't be able to unhear it." My heart pounded. I'd been waiting for this moment for months. He poured 2 strong drinks and sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. "What I'm about to tell you is going to sound insane," he finally said. "It's going to make you sick. And you'll have to decide if you can still look at me the same way." Then he told me about Diddy. not the public persona, the real one. He told me about parties, the kind where substances flowed freely and inhibitions disappeared, where young, aspiring artists were isolated and compromised, where Diddy was doing things that shouldn't be done to vulnerable people. The details were graphic and disturbing. Predatory behavior, manipulation, coercion, dozens of victims, maybe more. This had been happening for years. 50 had encountered people damaged by it. People who'd come to him for help, too terrified to speak up because they knew what Diddy was capable of. "How long have you known?" I asked. "Years," he said quietly. "And you didn't do anything?" "I did what I could. I helped people. I documented what I could." But Diddy is powerful, and power protects itself. The victims are terrified. The evidence is hard to gather. He leaned forward, eyes intense. "I'm going to destroy Diddy," he said calmly, "through the system. I'm going to expose him so thoroughly that even the industry can't protect him anymore. And I need you to understand why." I was reeling. "If you go after him, he'll come after you," I said. "I know. I've made peace with it." He needed me to help gather information, connect him with victims, document evidence, be his witness. "This is dangerous," he warned, "not just legally. Diddy eliminates threats." "I understand," I said, but I didn't, not really. Over the following months, my life transformed. Publicly, I was still his assistant. Secretly, I was helping build a case against one of music's most powerful men. We met with victimized people, listened to their stories. I documented everything: names, dates, details, evidence. I became a repository of trauma. And with every person we spoke to, my understanding of 50 changed. He wasn't obsessed with Diddy out of competition. He was obsessed because he'd uncovered something monstrous, and he felt responsible for stopping it. There was a night where we met with a young woman who'd been victimized, terrified, traumatized. As she told her story, I watched 50's face. I'd never seen such compassion mixed with such rage and determination. I understood then this wasn't about ego or industry politics. This was about conscience. 50 was willing to sacrifice everything because he couldn't ignore what he knew. But the weight was visible on him. He aged years and months. The paranoia intensified. He became more isolated, more cautious, and I'd catch him looking at me with something in his eyes I couldn't identify. Something that looked like regret, like he regretted telling me, like he regretted pulling me into this, because now I was a liability too. A target. We were locked in this together now. Bound by knowledge. Bound by responsibility. Bound by something slowly poisoning us both. I didn't understand then that 50 wasn't just confessing. He was transferring a curse to me. A burden. A responsibility. A haunting. Once he'd done that, there was no going back. I wasn't just his employee anymore. I was his accomplice in something that would define the rest of my life. 6 months into this nightmare, everything imploded. I don't know how Diddy found out. Maybe it was a leaked conversation. Maybe someone in our circle talked. Maybe his network of informants was simply too vast to avoid. But one day, the walls started closing in. 50 received a message. Not a call. Not a direct confrontation. A message. Through intermediaries. Through people who made it clear that Diddy knew what we were doing. And he wasn't happy. The message was simple: stop or face consequences. I remember 50 sitting in his office, reading the communication, and his entire body going still. Like all the air had been sucked out of the room. "It's over," he said quietly. "What do you mean it's over?" I asked. "He knows. He knows what we're doing. He knows who we've talked to. He knows about the evidence we've gathered. My blood went cold. What do we do? I asked. 50 looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It was surrender mixed with something darker. Something that looked like acceptance of a terrible fate. We stop, he said. We have to stop. But the victims can't be helped if we're both dead, he interrupted harshly. For the first time since that night when he'd confessed, I saw fear in 50. Real, visceral fear. And it terrified me. Over the next few weeks, everything changed. The people we'd been working with suddenly went silent. The victims stopped answering calls. It was like a coordinated shutdown, like someone had pulled a switch and erased everything we'd been building. I realized later that Diddy had gotten to them, used his resources to intimidate them back into silence, to remind them what he was capable of. And 50 just stopped. He didn't fight. He didn't resist. He accepted it. But the cost was visible. He became a shell of himself, withdrawn, paranoid beyond what I'd ever seen. He'd spend entire days in his office, alone with the curtains drawn. And then came the worst part, the moment I'll never forget. 50 called me into his office on a Thursday afternoon. His face was gray. His eyes were hollow. I need you to leave, he said. I thought he meant leave the office. Leave for the day. I need you to leave, he repeated. Leave my organization. Leave my life. Completely. Effectively, immediately. My stomach dropped. 50, what are you talking about? You're a liability now, he said coldly. You know too much. And as long as you're around me, you're in danger. As long as you're connected to me, Diddy sees you as a threat. So we both disappear. We both. No, he cut me off. You leave. You go back to your life. You act like none of this happened. You become useless to him. And maybe he'll leave you alone. I was stunned, betrayed, confused. You're throwing me away? I'm saving your life, he said, and there was genuine pain in his voice. That's what I'm doing. By cutting me off, by making sure you're not connected to me when everything falls apart, he said quietly. Because it's going to fall apart. And I won't have your blood on my hands. That's when I understood what was really happening. 50 was sacrificing me, not out of malice, but out of something that felt like mercy. He was severing our connection so that when Diddy came for him, and 50 believed he would, I wouldn't be collateral damage. Where will I go? I asked. I don't care. Far away. Start over. Use the money I'm going to give you and disappear. Change your identity if you have to. Just don't look back. He had an envelope prepared. Cash. Enough to disappear for a while. Enough to start over. 50. Don't, he said. And his voice was so final, so broken, that I stopped. The last thing I'm going to tell you, he continued, is this. What we tried to do was right. What we uncovered was monstrous. And the fact that we couldn't finish it, that we had to walk away, that's going to haunt both of us forever. But at least you'll be alive. At least you'll have a chance to live a normal life. I left that day. I took the envelope. I walked out of his life completely. And I've been running ever since. Not physically. I didn't disappear into some new identity. But psychologically, emotionally, I've been running from that moment for over a decade. Because 50 was right about one thing, it haunts me. Every single day. The knowledge of what Diddy did. The victims we couldn't help. The case we couldn't build. The justice that never came. And the realization that 50 was willing to sacrifice our entire relationship. The brotherhood we built to protect me from being destroyed alongside him. That's the thing nobody understands about 50. He's not just ruthless, he's strategic about his ruthlessness. He makes calculated decisions about who gets hurt and who gets protected. And in that moment, he chose to protect me by burning our connection to ash. I never saw him again after that day. Never spoke to him. The few times I tried to reach out in the early days, my calls didn't go through. My emails got no response. He'd erased me just like I'd erased myself, and I spent years wondering if he was right to do it. If this was some form of twisted mercy, or if it was just another form of the manipulation that 50 was capable of. Because here's what I've realized. I don't actually know if 50 was protecting me or using me. I don't know if he genuinely feared for my safety or if he just needed to clean up loose ends. I don't know if his sacrifice was genuine or if it was strategic. And that uncertainty, that not knowing, is part of what haunts me. I walked away from 50 Cent that day thinking I was escaping a curse, but I didn't understand that the real curse wasn't staying near him, it was leaving him. Because walking away meant I could never know the full truth. It meant I'd spend the rest of my life wondering if the man I trusted had sacrificed me out of love or out of necessity. And that question would eat at me in ways I couldn't have anticipated. The years after I left 50 were strange. On the surface, my life looked normal. New job, new friends, a regular existence. But underneath, everything was fractured. I couldn't watch music news without wondering about what was really happening behind the scenes. I couldn't read industry stories without thinking about the victims, about the evidence we'd gathered, about the justice that never came. And I couldn't stop thinking about 50. I told myself I'd moved on, that the past was behind me. But it wasn't. It was always there, like poison seeping through my veins. The silence between us became a presence in my life, a constant ghost. I tried reaching out a few times in those early years, called mutual contacts, asked if they'd seen him, but everyone either didn't know or wouldn't tell me. The doors were closed. 50 had effectively disappeared from my life, and I was left with nothing but questions. There were nights I couldn't sleep. I'd replay conversations, analyze moments, try to figure out if I'd missed something, if maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But I hadn't. I knew what I'd heard. I knew what I'd witnessed. I developed paranoia, convinced people were watching me, that my phone was monitored. I lived like a ghost, present but invisible. Years went by. I built a life that looked good on the outside, but inside, I was hollow. Then in 2020, Diddy's house was raided by federal agents. When I saw those images, something cracked inside me. Maybe it's finally happening, I thought. Maybe someone's finally going to investigate. Maybe the truth is finally coming out. But there was nothing concrete. Just rumors, just speculation, and then nothing. The raid faded from the news. Life moved on. I started drinking, not heavily, but consistently. Just enough to quiet the voice asking, "Why didn't you do more?" I tried to find 50 again, reached out to old contacts, asked if anyone knew how to get in touch with him. One person actually called me back. "Don't do this," he said. "Don't go back down that road." "What happened to him?" I asked. There was a long silence. "He's still alive," he finally said. "But he's not the same person you knew. None of us are. We're all just trying to forget." That was the closest I got to understanding what happened to 50 after I left. He was alive, but he wasn't okay. None of us were. I realized then that 50's sacrifice hadn't actually saved me. It had just delayed my haunting. The knowledge doesn't go away. The memories don't fade. The weight doesn't get lighter. You just learn to carry it. And every so often something happens, a news story, a song, and the weight becomes unbearable again, and you remember exactly why you can't move on. I thought leaving 50 meant I could escape the curse. But I was wrong. The curse followed me. It lived in my silence. It fed on my inaction. And every year that passed without justice, it grew stronger. 50 had tried to save me by cutting me loose, but what he'd actually done was sentence me to a lifetime of haunting. And I was finally starting to understand why he'd looked so broken that last day. This is where I have to be honest with you. About everything. About why I'm telling you this story now, after all these years of silence. For a long time, I told myself that I couldn't speak about this, that it was too dangerous, that talking would put me in jeopardy, that the smart thing to do was to stay silent and invisible, just like 50 had instructed me to do. But silence is its own kind of prison. In November 2023, everything changed. Federal agents arrested Diddy, not on a raid that faded from the news cycle, not on speculation or rumors, on actual charges. Real investigation. The kind of justice system involvement that suggested something massive was finally happening. And when I saw that arrest, when I read the details of what he was being charged with, I realized something that broke me in a different way. We could have prevented this if we'd kept going, if we'd finished what we started, if I hadn't walked away. All those victims, all those years of silence, all that suffering that continued because we stopped fighting. And 50 had known. He'd known that walking away meant more victims would suffer. He'd known that by cutting me loose, by stopping the investigation, he was condemning future people to the same trauma that previous victims had endured. But he did it anyway. To protect me. That's the thing about 50 that I finally understand now. His sacrifice wasn't an act of mercy. It was an act of mercy disguised as betrayal. He needed me to hate him. He needed me to feel abandoned. Because if I'd stayed, if I'd continued to trust him, I would have stayed in that fight with him until it consumed us both. By cutting me off, by making me feel like I'd been thrown away, he gave me the psychological permission to move on, to build a life, to survive. But he didn't survive it the same way. I've learned through the years and through various sources that 50 continued to work on exposing Diddy even after cutting me off. Quietly, strategically, building cases, connecting with people, documenting evidence, all while being isolated, all while knowing that Diddy had him in his sights. He became obsessed. Not the healthy kind of obsessed, the kind that destroys you from the inside. And when Diddy was finally arrested, when the federal investigation finally took off, 50 was there. Not publicly taking credit, not seeking validation, but there, finally seeing some form of justice happen. I don't know if what we started all those years ago directly led to Diddy's arrest. I don't know if the evidence we gathered played a role. I don't know if 50's continued efforts behind the scenes were the catalyst. But I know this. The truth came out. Eventually, despite our silence, despite our abandonment of the fight, despite everything. And I know that 50 sacrificed our entire relationship, the brotherhood we'd built, the trust between us, the only real connection he had to someone who understood what he was carrying. so that I could have a life outside of that haunting. That's what still haunts me. Not the knowledge of what Diddy did, not the guilt of walking away, but the realization that 50 loved me enough to make me hate him. He knew that if I stayed, I would destroy myself trying to seek justice. So he destroyed our relationship instead. He made himself the villain in my story so that I wouldn't have to be the victim in his. And I spent over a decade angry at him for that, feeling betrayed, feeling abandoned, not understanding that every moment he was pushing me away, he was also protecting me. I'm telling you this story now because the haunting has changed. It's no longer a haunting about guilt or regret or unanswered questions. It's a haunting about understanding the true cost of what 50 sacrificed. He gave up everything: his safety, his peace of mind, his ability to ever truly trust another person, his humanity in some ways, all so that he could fight alone, all so that I could be free. And the cruelest part, the part that really haunts me, I didn't appreciate that sacrifice until it was too late to thank him for it. I don't know if 50 is alive or dead. I don't know if he's at peace. I don't know if he regrets what he did or if he'd do it again. I don't know if he ever forgave me for leaving. I don't know if he thinks about me at all. But I think about him every single day. I think about the weight he carried alone. I think about the cost of his conscience. I think about what it means to love someone enough to let them hate you. And I think about the victims, the people who finally got justice because someone, 50, was willing to sacrifice everything to make sure their voices were heard, even when those voices couldn't speak for themselves. That's the truth that haunts me. Not the darkness of what Diddy did, not the horror of the crimes, not the guilt of my silence, but the nobility of 50's sacrifice, the tragic beauty of his willingness to destroy himself so that others could be saved. He told me that night, years ago, what I'm about to tell you will haunt you forever. He was right, but not in the way I thought. The haunting isn't about the evil, it's about the goodness. It's about bearing witness to someone's willingness to be destroyed by their own conscience. It's about understanding that sometimes the most powerful people in the world are the ones who are willing to give up everything because they can't live with themselves if they don't. 50 Cent came up in an industry built on exploitation. He had access to power and money and influence. He could have stayed silent. He could have looked the other way. He could have protected himself, but he didn't. And that's what will haunt me until the day I die. Not the betrayal, the mercy.